After just 6 months of marriage, I discovered the shocking truth about my wife. She never wanted me. She wanted what I owned. One day, she stood in front of me and demanded my house, as if everything I built was hers to take. In that moment, I knew I had a choice: give in to her greed or fight back in a way she would never see coming. What would you do if the person you loved turned out to be after your house?
My name is David Harrison, and I thought I had found my soulmate in Sarah. At 42, I had built a successful construction business from the ground up after my divorce 5 years earlier. My ex-wife Lisa and I had parted amicably. We simply grew apart after 15 years together. She kept the smaller house we had bought together, and I worked tirelessly to build something new for myself. The house Sarah was now demanding wasn't just property, it was my sanctuary. A beautiful colonial-style home in an upscale neighborhood of Westfield, Massachusetts, complete with a 3-car garage, a swimming pool, and a workshop where I still practiced carpentry as a hobby. Every beam, every fixture, every carefully chosen detail represented years of sacrifice and dreams rebuilt from scratch. I met Sarah at a charity fundraiser for local veterans, an event I attended annually because my father had served in Vietnam. She was volunteering, helping to organize the silent auction, and her dedication to the cause immediately caught my attention. Sarah Martinez was stunning, with long dark hair and an infectious smile that lit up the room. She seemed genuinely interested in my stories about renovating historic homes and appeared fascinated by my business. Our whirlwind romance lasted only for months before she suggested we get married. "Life's too short to wait," she said, tears in her eyes as she talked about her father's recent passing. She claimed she wanted security, a stable home, someone who would love and protect her. Like a fool blinded by what I thought was love, I believed every word. The first few months of marriage felt like a dream. Sarah quit her part-time job at the local bank, saying she wanted to focus on being a good wife and maybe starting a family. She redecorated parts of the house, hosted dinner parties for my business associates, and seemed to fit perfectly into my life. My friends commented on how happy I looked, how Sarah had brought new energy into my world. But slowly, things began to change. Sarah started making comments about our house, about decisions that needed to be made regarding our property. She began questioning why my name was the only one on the deed, suggesting that as my wife, she should have equal ownership. When I explained that the house was built with money from my business and was purchased before our marriage, she would sulk for days. The final confrontation came on a rainy Tuesday evening in October. I had just returned from a difficult job site where we discovered structural problems that would cost us thousands to fix. I was exhausted, stressed about the financial implications, and looking forward to a quiet evening at home. Instead, I found Sarah pacing in the living room, a stack of legal documents in her hands. "David, we need to talk," Sarah said, her voice cold and determined in a way I'd never heard before. She held up the papers with a triumphant smile that made my blood run cold. "I've been consulting with a lawyer, and I know my rights as your wife." My heart pounded as I tried to process what was happening. "What are you talking about, Sarah? What lawyer?" She threw the documents onto our coffee table, the same coffee table I had handcrafted from reclaimed oak as a wedding gift for us. "I want half of this house, David. I want my name on the deed, and I want it done within 30 days. If you refuse, I'll file for divorce and take you for everything you're worth." The room seemed to spin around me. This was the woman who had promised to love and support me, who had cried when I proposed, who had written her own vows about building a life together based on trust and partnership. Now she stood before me like a stranger, making demands with the calculated precision of a business transaction. "Sarah, this house was mine before we married, you know that. I built this life after my divorce, and now I'm your wife," she interrupted, her voice rising. "That means I'm entitled to half of everything. Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't know what community property means?" I sat down heavily, trying to gather my thoughts. Massachusetts wasn't a community property state, but I knew she was counting on my ignorance or my desire to avoid a messy legal battle. The cold calculation in her eyes was like looking at a complete stranger. "Where did this come from?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "6 months ago, you said you loved me. You said you wanted to build a life together." She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the house we had called home. "Oh, David, you're such a good man, but you're so naive. Do you think a woman like me would normally be interested in someone like you?" The words hit like physical blows. Here, in this very room where we had hosted friends and family, where we had talked about our future together, Sarah was revealing her true nature. She had played a part for months, studying my weaknesses, learning what I valued most, and now she was ready to take it all. But as I looked around this room at the crown molding I had installed myself, at the fireplace where we had spent cozy evenings together, at the family photos that included her smiling face, something inside me hardened. I thought about my father, who had always taught me that a man's worth and his integrity were all he really owned. I thought about the years of work, the sacrifices, the dreams that had gone into building this life. Speaking of dreams and building a life, I'm curious, what city or town are you from? Share your hometown in the comments below. It's amazing how the places we call home shape who we become, isn't it? That night, after Sarah retreated to what I now realized was her strategic position in my guest bedroom, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my workshop, surrounded by the tools that had helped me build my business and my life, trying to process the magnitude of the deception. The woman I had married was essentially a stranger, and I needed to understand exactly who she was and what she was planning. The next morning, I called my lawyer, Robert Chen, who had helped me with my business contracts and my previous divorce. Robert was a sharp attorney in his 50s who had built his practice on helping small business owners protect their assets. When I explained what had happened, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "David, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Robert said, his voice serious. "Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and don't make any financial moves without talking to me first. What you're describing sounds like a carefully planned scheme. We need to investigate your wife's background thoroughly." Over the next few days, I began to notice things I had previously overlooked or dismissed. Sarah's stories about her past had always been vague and slightly inconsistent. She claimed to have grown up in California, but couldn't name specific neighborhoods or schools when pressed for details. Her references to family members were similarly nebulous, and I realized I had never actually met any of her relatives, even at our wedding. Robert hired a private investigator named Janet Mills, a former police detective who specialized in financial fraud cases. Within a week, Janet uncovered information that made my blood run cold. Sarah Martinez wasn't even her real name. She was actually Sandra Mitchell, and she had been married twice before, both times to older men with significant assets. Her first husband, a retired accountant from Florida, had died under mysterious circumstances just 14 months after their marriage. While no foul play was ever proven, Sandra had inherited his entire estate after a brief legal battle with his adult children. Her second husband, a widowed dentist from Arizona, had divorced her after 8 months when he discovered she had been systematically draining his bank accounts and had forged his signature on several financial documents. The pattern was always the same. Sandra would target recently divorced or widowed men who had rebuilt their lives and accumulated assets. She would present herself as a vulnerable woman looking for love and security, play the role perfectly for several months, then make her move to claim half of everything through marriage loss or inheritance. But this time, she had made a crucial mistake. I was neither elderly nor naive about legal matters, and I had resources she hadn't anticipated. More importantly, I had something she didn't: patience and the ability to plan strategically. As I learned more about Sandra's true identity, I also discovered that she wasn't working alone. The lawyer she had consulted was Marcus Webb, an attorney who had been sanctioned twice by the state bar for unethical practices. Webb specialized in helping people exploit loopholes in marriage and divorce law, particularly targeting men who might be intimidated into settlement rather than fighting in court. Armed with this information, Robert and I developed a comprehensive strategy to not only protect my assets, but to ensure that Sandra faced consequences for her fraudulent behavior. The plan required patience, careful documentation, and the willingness to let Sandra believe she was winning while we gathered evidence. First, we filed a motion to freeze all joint accounts and assets pending a full investigation into Sandra's identity and background. This would prevent her from accessing any of my money while we built our case. We also placed alerts on all my credit accounts and business finances to prevent any unauthorized transactions. Next, we began documenting everything. I installed security cameras throughout the house legally, since it was my property, and began recording every conversation I had with Sandra. Massachusetts is a two-party consent state for recording, so I had to be careful about how we gather audio evidence, but the video surveillance would be crucial for proving her behavior and intentions. The most difficult part of the strategy was continuing to live with Sandra while knowing the truth about who she was. Every morning, she would ask about my decision regarding the house deed, becoming increasingly aggressive and threatening when I stalled for time. She brought Webb to the house twice, where he made veiled threats about what would happen if I didn't cooperate voluntarily. "Mr. Harrison," Webb said during his second visit, sitting uninvited at my kitchen table, "my client is being very reasonable. She could demand much more. Considering the circumstances of your marriage and the assets involved, I suggest you consider the benefits of an amicable resolution." What Webb didn't know was that every word was being recorded, and his presence in my home without proper legal standing was actually strengthening our case. Robert had advised me to appear cooperative while never actually agreeing to anything concrete. During this time, I also reached out to Sandra's previous victims through Janet's investigation. The dentist from Arizona, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, was particularly helpful. He had kept detailed records of Sandra's behavior and had discovered evidence of forged documents that he had never been able to use effectively because she had disappeared before he could take legal action. "She's smart," Dr. Rodriguez warned me during a phone call. "She knows exactly how to manipulate the system and how to make men feel guilty for protecting themselves. Don't let her play the victim card, it's all an act." The accountant's adult children from Florida were also willing to cooperate. While they hadn't been able to prove anything criminal regarding their father's death, they had documentation of Sandra's suspicious behavior in the months leading up to his passing, including large cash withdrawals and changes to his will that he had never discussed with family members. As the evidence mounted, I began to understand the full scope of Sandra's operation. She wasn't just a gold digger looking for an easy payday, she was a professional con artist who had refined her methods over years of practice. The tears, the vulnerability, the perfect girlfriend acted was all carefully calculated to exploit the emotions and desires of lonely men looking for companionship. 3 weeks after Sandra's initial ultimatum, her patience finally ran out. She had grown increasingly frustrated with my delays and excuses, and the supportive wife facade began to crack completely. What I witnessed during this period confirmed everything our investigation had uncovered and provided crucial evidence for our case. It started with small incidents. Sandra would lose her temper when I asked innocent questions about her past, or she would make cutting remarks about my business or appearance when she thought I wasn't paying attention. But the real revelation came when she thought I was out of town on a job site. I had told Sandra I would be in Springfield for 3 days overseeing a major renovation project. Instead, I stayed at a local hotel and monitored the house through the security system Robert and I had installed. What I saw over those 3 days was like watching a completely different person inhabit my home. Sandra spent hours on phone calls with what appeared to be other accomplices, discussing strategy and timeline. She met with Webb at the house multiple times, going through my personal papers and photographing important documents. Most disturbingly, she brought strangers into my home, people who appeared to be appraising furniture and valuables, as if she was already planning to sell everything. On the second night, she hosted what can only be described as a celebration party. A group of people I had never seen before came to my house, drinking my wine and laughing about what Sandra called the latest mark. Through the audio we were able to capture legally, I heard her describe me as desperate and pathetic and joke about how easy it had been to convince me to marry her. The best part, Sandra laughed, is that he actually thinks I love him. Did you see the way he looks at me, like I'm some kind of prize? Men like David are so easy, they're so grateful that a woman like me would pay attention to them, that they'll give you anything you want. The cruelest moment came when one of her friends asked if she felt any guilt about what she was doing. Sandra's response was captured perfectly by our surveillance system. Guilt. These men are lonely and pathetic. I'm providing a service. They get a few months of feeling important and desired, and I get compensated for my time. It's a fair trade. When I returned home the next evening, Sandra greeted me with tears and complaints about how lonely she had been, how much she had missed me, and how she had spent the entire time thinking about our future together. The performance was flawless, but now I could see every calculated gesture, every practiced expression of emotion. That night, she escalated her demands. "David, I've been patient, but my lawyer says we can't wait any longer. I need you to sign the papers adding my name to the deed, or I'll have to take legal action. You don't want this to get ugly, do you?" The implied threat was clear, but what Sandra didn't realize was that every threat, every manipulation, every moment of her true character was being documented. She had become so confident in her ability to control the situation that she was making mistakes, crucial errors that would ultimately destroy her case. As word began to spread through our small community about the troubles in my marriage, I discovered another layer of Sandra's manipulation that I hadn't anticipated. She had spent months building relationships with my neighbors, friends, and business associates, carefully crafting a narrative that would work in her favor when the truth came out. To my shock, many people I considered close friends initially sided with Sandra. She had played the role of devoted wife so convincingly that when rumors of divorce proceedings began to circulate, she was able to position herself as the victim of a cruel and greedy husband who was trying to leave her with nothing. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had always been friendly, actually confronted me at the grocery store. "David Harrison, I'm ashamed of you," she said loud enough for other shoppers to hear. "That sweet girl has done nothing but love and support you, and now you want to throw her out on the street just to protect your precious house." Even some of my business clients began to question my character. Sandra had attended several company events and had made a point of volunteering for local charities in my name, creating the impression that she was a devoted partner who had sacrificed her own career to support my success. When she began telling people that I was threatening to divorce her and leave her homeless, it fit the narrative of a successful man who had used a vulnerable woman and was now discarding her. The isolation was devastating. Men I had known for years, clients who had trusted me with their homes and businesses, even some family members began to distance themselves. Sandra had played her role so perfectly that the idea of her being a calculating con artist seemed impossible to people who had only seen her public persona. But Robert had warned me this would happen. "She's done this before," he reminded me during one particularly difficult week when I lost two major clients who said it couldn't work with someone who treated women so poorly. "This is part of her strategy. She's counting on community pressure to force you into settling rather than fighting." The breakthrough came when Dr. Rodriguez flew in from Arizona to meet with some of my friends and business associates. His first-hand account of his experience with Sandra, combined with the documentation Janet had gathered, began to change minds. When people heard that Sandra had a history of targeting successful men and had used multiple identities, the pieces began to fall into place. My friend Tom Miller, who owned a local restaurant where Sandra and I had been regular customers, was one of the first to come forward with concerns he had never voiced. "I always thought something was off about her," he admitted. "She would ask too many questions about your business, about your finances. And she never seemed to know basic things about her own background. When people asked about her family or her childhood, she would change the subject. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Other community members started to remember inconsistencies in Sandra's stories, moments when her facade had slipped, or times when her behavior had seemed calculated rather than genuine. The very charm and manipulation skills that had initially worked in her favor began to work against her as people realized they had been deceived. As our court date approached, Sandra and her lawyer Marcus Webb became increasingly desperate and aggressive in their tactics. What they didn't realize was that every move they made was actually strengthening our case and providing additional evidence of fraudulent intent. Webb filed a series of motions designed to intimidate and exhaust my resources. He requested emergency spousal support, claiming that Sandra was suffering financial hardship because I had abandoned my marital responsibilities. He demanded access to all my business records, claiming that I was hiding assets that rightfully belonged to Sandra as my wife. Most audaciously, he filed a motion for immediate occupancy rights, arguing that I was creating a hostile environment that was harmful to Sandra's mental health. Each motion was more expensive to fight than the last, and I could see Webb's strategy clearly. He wanted to drain my finances and wear down my resolve until settling out of court seemed like the easier option. But Robert had anticipated this approach, and we had prepared for a long battle. The turning point came when Janet's investigation uncovered Sandra's most recent victim than she had been seeing while married to me. Through financial records and surveillance, we discovered that Sandra was simultaneously running a con on Thomas Bradley, a recently widowed businessman from Hartford, Connecticut. While she was demanding half my house and playing the role of devoted wife, Sandra was also courting Thomas, telling him she was a recently divorced woman looking for a fresh start. She had convinced him to loan her $15,000 for what she claimed were medical bills from her sick mother, and was in the process of convincing him to add her name to his investment accounts. When Robert contacted Thomas and explained the situation, he was initially skeptical. "That can't be right," he said. "Sarah Martinez would never do something like that. She's one of the most honest, caring women I've ever met." But when we showed Thomas copies of Sandra's marriage certificate to me, photographs of her at our wedding, and documentation of her real identity as Sandra Mitchell, his disbelief turned to rage. He had been planning to propose to her the following month and had already revised his will to include her as a beneficiary. Thomas agreed to cooperate fully with our case. He provided recordings of phone conversations where Sandra had made statements about her abusive ex-husband who was trying to steal her share of their assets. More importantly, he had documentation of the financial fraud she was perpetrating against him, which established a clear pattern of criminal behavior. With this new evidence, Robert filed a countersuit against Sandra for fraud, identity theft, and bigamy. Under Massachusetts law, attempting to enter into a marriage while already married to someone else was a felony, even though Sandra hadn't technically married Thomas yet. The evidence showed clear intent to defraud multiple victims simultaneously. Wedd's response to our countersuit was to withdraw from the case entirely. Faced with potential criminal charges and disbarment proceedings, he apparently decided that Sandra was no longer worth the risk. This left Sandra scrambling to find new representation just weeks before our court date, and most reputable attorneys were unwilling to take on a case with such obvious criminal implications. The day of our hearing arrived on a crisp November morning. Sandra entered the courtroom with her new attorney, a young lawyer named Jennifer Hayes who clearly didn't understand the full scope of what she was walking into. Sandra had apparently told her a carefully edited version of events, presenting herself as a victim of a vindictive husband and an overzealous investigation. Judge Patricia Williams presided over our case, and I could tell immediately that she had reviewed all the evidence thoroughly. As someone who had spent 20 years on the bench dealing with divorce proceedings, she had undoubtedly seen every type of manipulation and fraud imaginable. Sandra's attorney opened with an emotional appeal about a devoted wife who had sacrificed her career and independence to support her husband, only to be threatened with abandonment and homelessness when the marriage became inconvenient for him. It was a compelling narrative, delivered with passion and conviction, and I could see some sympathy in the faces of people in the courtroom gallery. But Robert's presentation was devastating in its thoroughness. He began by establishing Sandra's true identity, showing copies of birth certificates, previous marriage licenses, and documentation of her various aliases. He presented testimony from Dr. Rodriguez and the accountant's children, establishing a clear pattern of predatory behavior spanning multiple states and several years. The security footage from my house was particularly damaging. The judge watched Sandra's celebration party, listening to her describe me as desperate and pathetic and laugh about how easy it had been to manipulate me. The contrast between this footage and Sandra's current presentation as a loving wife was stark and undeniable. When Thomas Bradley took the stand to testify about Sandra's simultaneous con against him, the courtroom was completely silent. His testimony about how Sandra had convinced him she was single and available for marriage, while simultaneously demanding half my assets, was devastating to her credibility. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Robert played a recording of Sandra threatening to destroy me if I didn't give her what she wanted. Her voice, cold and calculating as she described how she would turn the community against me and ruin my business reputation, was captured clearly on the audio system we had legally installed. Sandra's testimony in her own defense was a masterclass in manipulation and deflection. She claimed that she had genuinely loved me, that her behavior was the result of feeling abandoned and betrayed, and that the evidence against her was either taken out of context or fabricated entirely. She cried convincingly as she described her fear of being left homeless and destitute. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. The performance was so convincing, so emotionally charged, that I could see why she had been successful in her previous cons, but then I remembered the laughter at her party, the calculated coldness in her voice as she planned my destruction, and I knew that this too was just another performance. Judge Williams listened to everything with careful attention, taking notes and asking pointed questions that showed she understood exactly what was happening in her courtroom. After a brief recess, Judge Williams returned with her decision, and her words still echo in my mind today. "In 20 years on this bench," she began, "I have rarely seen such a calculated and systematic attempt to defraud someone through the institution of marriage. This case represents not just a personal betrayal, but a violation of the legal and social contracts that make marriage meaningful in our society." The judge systematically dismantled every aspect of Sandra's case. She ruled that the marriage had been entered into fraudulently, with Sandra having no intention of fulfilling her marital obligations, but rather seeking only to exploit Massachusetts marriage laws for financial gain. She noted that Sandra's use of a false identity constituted grounds for annulment, making any claims to marital property invalid, but Judge Williams didn't stop there. She also ruled in favor of our countersuit, ordering Sandra to pay restitution for the legal fees, investigation costs, and business losses had suffered as a result of her fraud. The total judgment came to over $75,000, money that Sandra clearly didn't have but would be legally obligated to pay. Most importantly, the judge referred Sandra's case to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution on charges of fraud, identity theft, and attempted bigamy. As court officers approached Sandra with an arrest warrant that had been prepared based on our evidence, the mask finally came off completely. Gone was the vulnerable, tearful woman who had been testifying just hours earlier. Sandra's face contorted with rage as she screamed at me across the courtroom. "You think you've won? You pathetic loser. I could have had any man I wanted, and I wasted months of my life on you. You're nothing, nothing." Her attorney tried to calm her down, but Sandra was beyond control. She continued screaming threats and insults as the officers handcuffed her, calling me every name imaginable and promising that she would find a way to make me pay for what I had done to her. The transformation was so complete, so shocking, that several people in the courtroom gallery gasped audibly. As Sandra was led away in handcuffs, I felt a mixture of emotions that was difficult to process. Relief was the strongest relief that this nightmare was finally over, that my home and my business were safe, that the truth had been revealed. But there was also sadness for what I had thought we shared, even though I now knew it had never been real. Thomas Bradley approached me as we left the courthouse. "Thank you," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "If you hadn't fought this, if you had just given her what she wanted, she would have destroyed me too. You saved my life savings, probably my life." That comment helped me understand that this case was about more than just my personal situation. By fighting Sandra's fraud and seeing it through to the end, we had prevented her from continuing to victimize other men who might not have had the resources or knowledge to protect themselves. 6 months later, as I write this story, Sandra is serving 18 months in state prison after pleading guilty to multiple fraud charges. The investigation that began with my case uncovered at least 2 other victims in different states, and she is facing additional charges there as well. Her days of targeting vulnerable men are over, at least for the foreseeable future. The house that she tried to steal is still my home, though it feels different now. I've made some changes: new locks, updated security system, and I've redecorated some of the rooms where Sandra's presence felt too strong. But more importantly, I've learned invaluable lessons about protecting myself and recognizing the warning signs that I missed the first time. First and most importantly, trust your instincts. There were dozens of small red flags that I ignored or rationalized away because I wanted to believe in what Sandra was presenting. When someone's stories don't quite add up, when they're vague about their past, when they push for commitment faster than feels natural, these aren't just quirks, they're warnings. Second, protect your assets legally before you need to. After this experience, I've restructured my finances and property ownership in ways that would make it much harder for someone to exploit marriage laws against me. I've also learned about prenuptial agreements and other legal protections that I wish I had understood before. Third, verify everything. It sounds cynical, but in today's world, it's too easy for people to create false identities and backgrounds. If I ever enter another serious relationship, I'll be doing background checks and verification as a matter of course, not because I'm paranoid, but because I'm responsible. Most importantly, I've learned that real love doesn't come with ultimatums, demands, or timelines. It doesn't ask you to give up everything you've worked for as proof of your commitment. Real love builds together, protects each other, and creates something stronger than what either person had alone. To anyone watching this who might be in a similar situation, don't ignore the warning signs. Don't let shame or embarrassment prevent you from seeking help. And remember that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. There are people out there who will exploit your loneliness, your generosity, and your desire for companionship. But there are also people who will genuinely love and support you. The irony is that Sandra's greed and impatience ultimately led to her downfall. If she had been content with a normal marriage, she might have eventually inherited everything she wanted through legitimate means. Instead, her need to control and manipulate immediately cost her everything and landed her in prison. As for me, I'm rebuilding not just my financial security, but my ability to trust and hope for genuine companionship. This experience was devastating, but it also showed me the strength of real friendships and taught me the value of fighting for what's right, even when it's difficult. If you found value in this story, please share it with others who might benefit from these lessons. And tell us in the comments what's your hometown. Sometimes our roots give us the strength we need to weather life's storms. Remember, you have the right to protect what you've built, and you should never feel guilty for refusing to be someone else's victim. Justice may not always be swift, but when we stand up for what's right, it does eventually prevail.